So it's disrespectful and also sort of ignoring God's will for you if you get a vaccination. But I bet all of the members of that congregation brush their teeth. They did a study of thought experiments like this, and guess what? People completely ignore the stipulations. So even though the thought experiment stipulates that the only way to save yourself is to drag the person in front of the arrow, nobody believes it. Why? Because their imagination tells them something else.
Hi, I'm Chelsea, and I'm here with my co-host, philosopher Kelly Weirich.
I'm Kelly, and I'm here with my co-host, philosopher Chelsea Haramia, and you're here with Storyfy, a podcast about storytellers, story lovers, and philosophy.
Today's story takes us to a humble hut in a rising storm. So batten your hatches, steel your nerves, and be sure to stick around afterwards as we chat about the philosophical themes with the author Eva Dadlez.
Playing God by Eva Dadlez. The wound was definitely infected. Gareth had hoped that simple cleansing might do the trick, but one look at the feverish patient on the cot demonstrated that it was not enough. Samuel had been trying to rescue a couple of people from the wreckage left by last week's tornado, when their house had pretty much fallen in on him in an explosion of splintered boards and rusty nails. When they brought Samuel in, Gareth had set his arm, but the thigh had been cut open to the bone, and was now dark and swollen. Soon it would begin to stink. They'd most of them known that an elixir, what the philosophers called an antibiotic, was required to prevent just the eventuality that confronted Gareth now. But no health custodian dared risk being charged with a heresy of intervention. Not without an indulgence, at any rate, and those were too expensive for anyone but a priest or second-level acolyte. Manfully resisting the urge to wring his hands, Gareth dipped a cloth in cold water and wiped Samuel's flushed face. The light was pretty poor in the cottage, since they'd only been able to afford the one window, glass being as pricey as it was, but they'd placed Samuel directly beneath it, and the little place was as spick and span as Gareth and Matilda could make it. They'd laid in stone over the dirt floor last year, something that kept things a good deal cleaner, and the kitchen area was neatly curtained off in a cubby, herbs suspended from the rafters drying in fat bunches. Matilda had even hung blue curtains at either side of the thick, bubbly glass of the window. Really, it was as spruce and respectable as any health custodian's abode could be. The 4 injunctions were prominently displayed on the wall facing the outer door, as were the several heresies to which custodians might find themselves falling a prey if they were not mindful. Mindfulness was one of the injunctions, made things easier to remember. Although not a devout person, Gareth had always taken the religious hierarchy to regard certain kinds of interventions as a form of cheating. All human beings were in it together, equally susceptible to the whims of fate and bad weather, equally vulnerable to the laws of nature established by divine will. To try to circumvent those laws, or duck them, or make oneself an exception to them, was to break faith with the human community, to betray the solidarity that forged the ties holding it together. There was a kind of logic to this, Gareth was willing to concede, but that logic made it all the less clear how it was that the wealthy and powerful could neatly make exceptions of themselves by purchasing injunctions whenever circumstances dictated. It was very frustrating to be told that it was all a mystery which mere lay people could not hope to understand. Gareth sighed and tried not to think about it, bringing his washcloth to the kitchen pump for a quick rinse. Not everyone lived as Gareth did, of course. Gareth, Matilda, and their neighbors had pooled resources and skills to put up most of the houses in their small enclave. The cluster of dwellings was tucked in the shadow of the greater temples of the city, where several of them worked as cleaners and assistants of assistants. The priests and their acolytes, and even some of the philosophers and artificers, lived in the temples themselves. These enormous and rather frightening structures had survived the Divine Crusades, perhaps even the Holy War of Consolidation. It was said that some of the temples had been standing for 1,000 years or more, their glassy surfaces witness to the world of a different millennium. The priests said that they were made of materials that could not be found in nature, and were therefore forbidden for use by the uninitiated. Huge panels rested on their rooftops, magically transferring the sunlight and its warmth to dark interiors. The philosophers constructed and maintained these devices. People like Gareth and Matilda and Samuel weren't allowed within 100 feet of the sun absorbers. The risk of corruption was too great. Matilda worked as an assistant to the acolyte of a priest of the third rank, who oversaw the work of some of the philosophers and artificers, mostly work involving the kinds of medical treatments that were only available with indulgences. There were well-guarded manufactories of such stuff, also of architectural materials, scattered throughout the city, though neither Gareth nor Maddie had ever been given a look inside. Most of their friends told Maddie that it was a real honor to work in one of the temples in whatever capacity, though Maddie appeared to have her doubts. Gareth had never said so, but he was always a little afraid that she'd speak her mind too freely. It wasn't a forgiving environment on the upper floors of the temples, where heretical testing went on at all hours of the day and night. To make things worse, there were heresies of intent as well as heresies of action. The former were the ones that could get you in trouble for what you said, and Maddie usually had a lot to say. Gareth kept his peace, however. Maddie was smart and knew perfectly well what was at stake. She didn't need reminding, so any warning from Gareth would show a lack of faith. Gareth loved Maddie and did not lack faith in her, but maybe he lacked faith a little in priests who didn't know her like he did. He shook his head and turned back to Samuel, who looked terrible. He hoped it wasn't the will of the Maker that Samuel die, though of course no one could really guess the will of the Maker, except a priest of higher rank. Then again, Maddie had been known to try. When Gareth was 7 or 8, his mother began to take him to children's services at the local meeting house. The priest explained to the cohort of children unwillingly assembled before him that using medications, apart from the rare indulgence-sanctioned application, was unacceptable, indeed the ultimate arrogance. It amounted to an attempt to circumvent the will of the Maker, as if anyone could, and was catastrophically disrespectful. The Maker was made angry by disrespect this dire, and would take steps to correct anyone foolish enough to try and undermine his purpose or intervene in his aims. The priest leaned forward, threateningly, his tall black hat casting a shadow from which the children leaned away. Since no single person could know what the Maker knew, the man continued, no one could be aware of the Maker's reason, and if it was the Maker's reason, it had to be right, for causing a person to be ill or injured. There was always a really good reason for someone's misfortune. Sometimes the Maker was punishing the person. Sometimes he was preventing something even worse from happening. It kind of made sense to Gareth until Matilda piped up. She wasn't having it. What if the Maker wanted people to use the medicines the priests had stockpiled? 8-year-old Maddie had asked, just so it would be easier to help people? Wasn't the bare existence of the medicines in such close proximity to the sick a clear sign from the Maker that he wanted them to be used? And what reason could the Maker have for making nice people sick? Or babies, or baby cows? A little calf had just died on Maddie's farmstead, and she was still distressed. The priest had harumphed portentously. He floated the notion that the medicines were there to test the faith and ability to resist temptation of souls who did not merit indulgences. Then he issued a spate of scary possibilities about things the Maker knew that ordinary people did not. Maybe the baby would grow up to be a terrible person. Maybe the nice person who was sick would, if he survived, travel to distant parts and then bring home a terrible plague for which no cure existed. Maybe the Maker was preventing just such an eventuality. But if the Maker could do anything, Maddie insisted, despite Gareth pinching her arm in warning, couldn't he fix things so that there was no plague in the first place? Or so that the nice traveler didn't catch it? The priest's expression had grown darker as he pointed out that the Maker did not like to intervene in things once they had been set in motion by his divine will. How do you know? Maddie had asked, and was summarily ignored. Nevertheless, she persisted. If everything happened according to divine will, she insisted, really sinking her teeth into it. Gareth closed his eyes. Then wouldn't people giving someone medicine without the intermediary step of an indulgence changing hands also be acting in accord with divine will? The Maker was responsible for everything that was, and that included how people chose to behave, did it not? The priest's face was almost purple by this time. He seemed to swell. Gareth almost expected him to pop. He was watching from behind his hands with one eye. Silence! The priest thundered. For the next 10 minutes or so, he railed extravagantly about the fate of those who thought to question the will of the Maker when they were fortunate enough to have at their disposal the expertise of the Maker's priests and acolytes to make it perfectly clear what his will was. What, could a mere child fathom what it took experts such as himself and his brethren scores of years to discern? Could a mere child even begin to discern the mysteries of his divine will? Matilda opened her mouth. No, he interjected quickly. She could not. She, in her innocence and ignorance, Matilda bridled, must put her trust in the wise priesthood that the Maker had put here to take care of her and those like her. He swept out before Maddie could get another word in. Years later, Matilda and Gareth realized what a close call this had actually been. Most priests today would suffer no qualms about accusing a child of heresy, or of inflicting the same punishment on her that would have been imposed on an adult. Matilda was plain lucky that she still possessed both hands and both ears. For all his fierceness, the priest presiding over that small class was apparently squeamish. Now, of course, they'd rooted such easygoing types out of the priesthood altogether. One needed to tread very carefully, Matilda especially, given how she was. Speak of the devil. Gareth had just wet the cloth again, this time using it to dribble water between Samuel's parched lips, when Matilda bustled in carrying an unfamiliar covered basket. If one's heart could rise and sink at the same time, that might explain what was happening in Gareth's midsection. Matilda carefully closed the door and affixed the latch. She leaned over Samuel to pull the curtains across the single window. Then she drew 2 syringes out of the basket, where they had been nestled among a batch of carrots and radishes. It wasn't as if she hadn't done this before. Matilda didn't do this kind of thing often, of course, but when it looked like someone was about to die. Samuel's sister Clorinda had applied for an indulgence for him 3 full days ago, and it was only today that the rejection had been issued. Maddie had muttered under her breath that they probably drew out the decision process just so that it would be taken out of their hands. An indulgence usually involved a stiff fee, such as only the priests and overseers could supply. Samuel's sister had nothing but her desperation. It was true that exceptions were occasionally made for someone whose work was important enough. The fee had been waived and the indulgence granted to the artificer devising architectural plans for the new temple, for instance, and to a noted pastry chef right before an important banquet with visiting dignitaries in attendance. But, at least in Gareth's experience, ordinary people never raided an indulgence, unless they found a buried treasure or the entire neighborhood had enough to pull together. Samuel's sister had been told that his injury was the will of the Maker, who would doubtless provide Samuel with a joyous afterlife in his glorious proximity. If the actions of a health custodian were not equal to the task, then Samuel's time had clearly come. It was pretty much a death sentence. It took all of 3 minutes. Clorinda had to run to Gareth and Maddie's in tears, throwing herself to the floor at Samuel's bedside. They'd promised to do what they could. What Maddie could do was a great deal, actually, provided she was willing to take the risk. And she was usually willing to take a risk, was Maddie. Gareth would, he reflected, probably do the same if he'd had the same access, but with a lot more trepidation and a lot less enthusiasm. By spying on the philosophers and priests, and by befriending a few apprentice philosophers, Matilda had learned how to give injections, at least in theory, fill syringes, and a bit about the various medicines the priests always had on hand. Sealing those medicines was easy enough if you were entrusted with one of the chief acolyte's keys when he wanted you to fetch beer from the stores because he was too lazy to get it himself. You just had to be sure never to take too much medicine so that no one would notice anything was missing. Since few even understood what syringes were or how they worked, priestly concerns about pilfering were not high. No one checked fluid levels in containers, at least to Maddie's knowledge, and she always brought syringes back. Gareth watched Matilda give Samuel the injections. "What is it?" he asked. These things had names from before, he reckoned. It seemed silly to keep thinking of them as magic elixirs. "This one is the only antibiotic I could get a hold of," she said, placing the empty syringe back in the basket for disposal in the temple. "The other one was supposed to prevent an especially bad infection called tetanus. I have no idea if any of this will help. He may already be too far gone. It was my first chance to get into storage. I was ready to pocket the key when Argent wasn't looking, but he was always looking. Better to go down there on orders anyway." She patted Samuel's good arm, covered the basket, shoved it under the table, and opened the curtains. "I don't like the look of that sky at all. Should we think of moving him to the shelter?" Gareth began to help her roll back the rug. "Did you ever wonder why they drew the line at medicines and vaccinations, but not at cleansing wounds or brushing teeth or sheltering from a storm?" Maddie asked. "I mean, if intervening in a natural process or preventing its getting started counts as some kind of a subversion to the Maker's will. Do you think it's that they want to keep the medicines to themselves because there's a limited supply? while soap and water for cleansing are practically free? Maddie snorted. Naturally, that's what I think, because it's true. But I'm interested in discovering what kind of self-justifying logic they've concocted to cover their priestly asses. So take the preventative medicines they call vaccines. You cannot get one without an indulgence because, I guess the idea is that if the Maker wanted to spare you, he'd do it. Maybe permitting a situation to exist in which you have the wherewithal to buy an indulgence even counts as an act of the Maker to save you. On the other hand, taking steps other than indulgence buying to protect yourself shows that you don't have faith that the Maker will do it, and also that you think you know better than he does, and also that you're trying to undermine any attempt he might make to smite you with the infection. So we have a heretical trifecta. Gareth glanced up at the framed list of heresies on the wall. Yep. As a bonus, he figured they'd committed at least one just by talking about such things. He folded his arms across his chest and glanced at Samuel. He didn't look any worse. Maybe Maddie's risk had stopped his decline. He knew better than to hope, but he figured a chance was a chance. He could hear the wind whipping up. It was tornado season. Every spring, what the priests would call the Maker's will inflicted heavy losses on the part of the population that didn't dwell in temples with large basements. Gareth, Maddie, and a number of friends had put in a small but sturdy storm cellar where they'd laid in the stone floor. Folks had teamed up to dig several of those over the past 2 years, as the storms had become more violent, and the priests had begun to bar the citizenry from the temples in inclement weather. It had stout beams shoring up the walls and ceiling. More importantly, it had room for Samuel's cot. This wind had blown up out of nowhere, just like the terrible winds of last month. It wasn't raining yet, but the sky looked black as Gareth peered out the window. Run out and bolt the shutters over the window, will you? We'll never be able to replace it. Matilda was already out the door, the wind slamming it all the way open behind her with a crack. A stack of papers flew across the room and smacked into the back wall. The injunctions canted over at a slant on their nail. Gareth opened the trap door in the floor and tugged Samuel's body down next to it by pulling it across the room on a blanket. Breathing heavily, he folded the cot and pitched it down, trying to remember if he'd refilled the water jug since last time. He'd check later. Samuel's body was lowered cautiously to rest on the angled 5-foot ladder, at least as much of it as would fit, preparatory to sliding him down to the shelter as carefully as possible. Gareth was checking to make sure that the injured limb still had its protective wrapping in place when he caught sight of a wild-haired Maddie in the doorway. Something wasn't right. He twitched the ladder and Samuel tumbled gently to his side. Thankfully not the side with the injured leg and arm, but this was still not ideal as a healer move. Good thing Samuel wasn't conscious at the moment. There was an emergency to address, however. Behind Maddie loomed 3 priests, one of whom was holding what appeared to be a writ of execution, presumably one of the special ones that convicted the recipient of a heresy. Each was discomposed by the rising wind, which threatened to tear the tall, cylindrical headdresses from their heads. The priest holding the writ could only stabilize his headgear with one hand, and looked especially irritable because of it. It did not help matters when the doorway proved low enough to require either the removal of the headgear altogether or some unseemly and undignified ducking. In other circumstances, it would have been funny. Right now, it was easy not to crack a smile. Dropping the trap door, Gareth rose and bowed respectfully. My abode is honored by the august presence of the priesthood, he intoned the formula. How may I be of service? The priest holding the scroll strode forward, waving it in the air, not in the least appeased by this show of proper decorum. Where is the woodworker, Samuel? He demanded. What have you done with him? More to the point, what have you two done? His eyes swept over Gareth and Matilda in no friendly way. How dared you rob the priesthood in order to subvert the will of the Maker? These are heresies of action, punishable by death or exile. Gareth briefly considered pretending he didn't know what they were talking about, but he just couldn't stomach it. He went to stand beside Maddie in solidarity. It also occurred to him that while they were outnumbered, the priests weren't paragons of strength and fitness. Something might yet be done. The death of your friend, continued the priest sternly, was clearly the Maker's will. Where is Samuel? We were told he was here. We have come to carry out the Maker's sentence and to bring you two to account for your violation of the codes we must all live by. What did they mean by carry out the Maker's sentence? Did they want to kill Samuel, just in case the injections worked? This was insane. But the priest droned on in accusatory tones, his robes billowing in the gusts of wind blowing ever more emphatically through the door. How you had the audacity to take the decision about Samuel's life out of the Maker's hands defies belief. Life and death are up to the Maker, not up to you. Matilda was going to go down fighting. Why wouldn't the Maker use me as his instrument to save a worthy soul? This did not go over well. The priest holding the writ actually blanched. Evil, blasphemous girl, shameless purveyor of lies, unregenerate thief. We can see, indeed all can see, the Maker's intent in everything he has caused nature to produce. Samuel's condition itself bore witness to the Maker's will. Fool, your interference in that will. The third priest had by this time found the basket with the syringes and held it triumphantly aloft to buttress the point. Has made your friend an abomination in the eyes of the Maker. You have harmed the very person that your perfidious actions aim to help. Thus comes the downfall that such transgressions earn. As if they had practiced it, the next priest stepped forward. The priesthood has declared him anathema. We must eliminate him in order to bring the course of nature once more into accord with the divine will. Oh, that didn't sound good. One of the self-proclaimed executioners was removing still another larger and more lethal-looking syringe from a pocket in his voluminous sleeve. Gareth was willing to lay odds that it wasn't medicine. He and Maddie lined up in front of the trap door, although Gareth wasn't certain that their adversaries had even seen him lower Samuel into the cellar. They seemed to have missed that in the excitement of protecting their hats from high winds and doorways. All he was sure they'd seen was the cellar's entrance. "Where is he? You dare not stand in the way of the law." Maddie was enraged. "So now you're killing people? Instead of just failing to save them when you could easily do it?" She put her hands on her hips and bellowed over the thunder outside. "Frankly, I think those two things are the same, morally speaking, even though most folks too often turn a blind eye to the second. But what you've done here is proof that by your lights there isn't a distinction to be made at all. Allowing people to die for lack of care was always the same as killing them for you. You are murderers." An equally infuriated priest swatted at Maddie and missed. She dodged aside and aimed an accurate kick at his shin. Then a crack of lightning very nearby brought them all to a standstill. "Get out!" Maddie shouted. "Go, run to your basement and lock everyone else out, just like last time." The priests looked at each other in consternation. A downpour was going on outside, and they could all hear heavy objects banging against the side of the house as they became airborne. They had been distracted by their Maker-sanctioned righteous indignation until it was too late to return to the temple. Well, multitasking was ever the prerogative of the religious. They could officially deliver the writ, which established Gareth and Matilda's guilt with respect to a number of heretical actions, and also eliminate the problematic carpenter, all while conscripting for themselves the cellar of people who are clearly unworthy of consideration. The chief priest informed Gareth and Maddie of this efficient plan with an air of complacent self-confidence. "It will be your privilege to provide us with protection befitting your betters. We realize that you had no time to prepare, and will be lenient about any shortcomings in the accommodation." Gareth picked up the poker. Maddie got the hoe out of the kitchen corner. "Out. Isn't seeking shelter an attempt to subvert the Maker's intention? One that is so clearly exhibited by his putting a nasty storm down right here and right now? Wouldn't the Maker keep you safe if you deserve to be safe? Let's just test that. Out!" Maddie took a swing with the hoe. All terrified people looked alike, Gareth reflected. Their faces seemed to go all limp and waxy. He felt pretty bad about this, but if allowed to stay, they would certainly try to end Samuel's life, in addition to ruining Gareth's and Maddie's. They would do so just because they believed it was a violation of the Maker's will to use medicine in an attempt to prevent his death. They wanted to undo the illicit intervention and to punish the interveners. So, thinking likewise, sending the priests out into the storm would save everyone the trouble of hunting them down to undo their ill-gotten salvation. And casting them out so the weather could have its way with them would save Samuel as well. "Just following your rules," Gareth muttered. "Just obeying the law." Maddie was enjoying this a lot more than he was. He wondered bitterly if they were all priests under the skin, just waiting for circumstances to bring it to the surface. The priests backed toward the doorway, retreating from what seemed like a present danger. Their mistake. Even Maddie didn't have it in her to beat someone to death with a hoe. Probably. "Go!" They cracked the door, and all three seemed virtually to be sucked out into the storm, leaving behind one somewhat dented headdress. Maddie threw herself against the door and barred it with Garrett's weight to back her up. Let's check on Samuel and hunker down. Gareth was gazing through the bubbly glass of their one window as Maddie climbed down to the cellar. One of the shutters had been ripped from the external wall, and he thought for a moment that he could see dimly into the heart of the deluge. 3 black shapes, like tattered crows spinning up into the darkness they'd invited. But really, it was hard to tell what was happening through all that rain. And it was out of his hands.
We're joined today by the author of Plain God. She has written 2 books on the philosophy of literature, What's Hecuba to Him and Mirrors to One Another, and edited a volume on philosophical approaches to Jane Austen's Emma for Oxford University Press. She has recently begun to explore fictional approaches to philosophical and political issues. That is, she now writes fiction as well as writing about it. Is Professor Emerita of Philosophy at the University of Central Oklahoma, Dr. Eva Dadlez. Welcome, Eva.
Hi, happy to be here.
Wonderful. We'd like to start off by offering you a choice of the big 3 questions. What did you write? Where did you write? And who did you write?
What I wrote is my sort of comeback to the kinds of stories we get in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and that kind of literature, that it's wrong to intervene with nature at a certain point, that it's wrong to play God. There's various philosophers, Leon Cass especially, who was on Bush's Biomedical Ethics Commission, Michael Sandel at Harvard, and others have long, complicated, convoluted arguments about how it's inappropriate to intervene in nature at a certain point. No genetic manipulation, no IVF, no cloning, no abortion, no birth control. It depends which one you're talking to, but there are long-winded arguments, and I wanted to see if I could make it go the other way. It really seemed like it would be interesting not to reject the advantages of science just because it intervened in the laws of nature. I'd like to address the sort of arguments used by religious groups to deprive their congregation of medical care. Usually the idea is that in Maddie's and Gareth's words, you're dissing God.
Mm-hmm.
It's disrespectful. You're intervening in the will of God. If God didn't want you to get smallpox, why then God would prevent it? So it's disrespectful and also sort of ignoring God's will for you if you get a vaccination. But I bet all of the members of that congregation brush their teeth. And the same argument would apply, right? They all brush their teeth, but that means you're subverting the will of God with respect to cavities, right? So I always found it surely maddening. I thought it was a very illogical argument. I wanted to address that.
I thought the teeth brushing moment was especially compelling as a kind of a gotcha to that kind of slippery slope reasoning. So this is a great question. When I do the Plain God kind of debates in my classes, we have the kind of knee-jerk reaction, like, of course we shouldn't be interfering. But then you start to ask students, well, what do you mean by interfering with kind of natural progression of things? And it becomes very clear very quickly that there's all sorts of things people are very comfortable with when it comes to interference. And then there is this sort of ceiling, and I think it's in different places for different people where they think you're going too far. So I'm curious to hear from you, Eva. Is there something that you think is actually too far?
I think some genetic enhancements are going too far and some are not. I think if you pick traits that would benefit nearly everyone, nearly all the time. So impulse control, intelligence. I mean, imagine having a nation of intelligent voters. It would be great. Intelligence, impulse control, longevity, health. Mm-hmm. Those would be great. Being blonde, being straight, no, right? That is going too far. And also, I mean, what would happen if we didn't make it available to everyone? We'd have an underclass of really stupid, unattractive, short-lived people who were the slaves of the others. That would be dreadful. But provided that the appropriate social architecture was in place, I don't have very many objections to the former kind of genetic enhancement.
It sounds like maybe the category of intervening in nature is like not morally relevant at all. Is kind of what comes out of this, right? The reason we don't make Frankensteins is not that it's not natural, it's that it's not good. It's not right to produce someone who has these features and then is just going to suffer. In some ways, these philosophical debates get us started on the wrong foot altogether. Like, is it okay to intervene in nature? And it's like, well, maybe that's just not what matters.
Yep, exactly. The Sandal argument is, I suppose, the most non-religious. It isn't interfering with the will of God. It's interfering with human solidarity in the face of things that follow from one another of necessity in this awful Aristotelian way. And you're violating that solidarity by making an exception of yourself. But of course, that's what the priests were doing in the story. I needed people to be violating the sense of solidarity to begin with, so I made them hypocrites. But even so, the idea is don't make an exception of yourself. You've only got a problem with genetic enhancement if it's only available to obscenely rich people.
And this reflects what we see in a lot of settings today, right? Where there's different kinds of accountability depending on who you are or how wealthy you are. Different laws apply or seem to apply. So you think you want to motivate your readers to balk at the unequal application of the law and to see that as clearly unfair. But I know a little about you, and I also see that Maddie sees no difference between killing and failing to save, which is just sort of a very utilitarian sentiment, What's going on here with your more utilitarian background and these more maybe justice-based kinds of ideas that show up in the story?
Well, I mean, the justice-based ideas that show up in the story, utilitarianism is hiding behind them.
Of course.
But one of the things that I also wanted to address, because I used to teach courses on this, God, it's weird being retired. It's very hard to convince students that letting die could be the moral equivalent of killing. And it's very easy to change their minds once you throw out a couple of stories. That's what's amazing.
Yeah.
Stories like this can act as a thought experiment. So that's Maddie pitching a fit at the priest at the end, saying, oh, wait a minute. You actually didn't believe it at all.
Mm-hmm. I love that we get Maddie asking these questions even as a child. Can you talk to us about including that?
I included that because I was once forced to attend religious ed by my mother, who wouldn't let me work for McGovern unless, in fact, I went to religious ed because I was 15 and entirely within her control. And so I was the atheist in religious ed. I announced I was an atheist. The priest was horrified. The class was horrified. But I will say my mother came through and then came to class to explain why Jesus was a socialist. Which was great.
I feel like there's a lot of Maddie in the discipline of philosophy itself.
Yeah.
This idea of like, hold on, that doesn't make sense. And this kind of egalitarian thought that we all get to think through these foundational issues for ourselves and the right to press against what authority says to us. So I love that in the story.
Thank you. Maddie was actually sort of Alistair Norcross. I went to grad school with him, and he was like having fun. So
I definitely believe that.
We went to grad school with him too, because he's a professor at CU Boulder, where Chelsea and I both went. So that's amazing.
I thought that the story did a good job of showing how easy it is to provide justifications for what are clearly unjust actions, prerogatives, laws. So I don't know if this is even going to end up being a question. I just want to tell a joke. So the priest says to young Maddie, when she's talking back, maybe the baby would grow up to be a terrible person. Maybe that's why babies suffer and die. Because we have this problem of evil when it comes to innocence suffering. And it reminded me of a joke that a friend of mine, his name is Brett, when I first joined Twitter, it was one of the first things I saw. The joke was, maybe Hitler turned out the way he did because of all the attempts on his life as a baby. Because of the long running, what would you do with a time machine? Well, I'd go back and kill him.
I love this line in the story where you say of Gareth, he was wondering bitterly if they were all priests under the skin.
Yeah.
Just waiting for circumstances to bring it to the surface. Can you say more about that?
I think anyone would wonder that a little bit. He could have prevented their dying and he didn't. And if he thinks killing and letting die are morally equivalent, it's on him. But then again, they're horrible people and the world is better off without them. It's easier to be Maddie than Garrett.
Mm.
Maddie thinks pretty clearly they should be gotten rid of, and that's it.
Yeah, I like that she is very philosophical in that she's questioning constantly. But then she also is very certain about many things, which is, I think, something that a lot of philosophers end up having less of, but also more comfort with uncertainty, right? So you get this nice mixture between Maddie and Gareth of the general kind of philosophical attitudes.
Yep, he's almost, but not quite a deontologist.
Yeah. The line from the priests, and maybe you were just doing this because you really want the reader to find them deplorable, but the line when they are trying to take over the shelter and they say, well, obviously, we're going to take that, and you're welcome for the opportunity to provide us with this. And we'll be lenient if it's not as nice as it should be for us, right? And that really incredibly twisted kind of logic that is the hallmark of how manipulative and abusive people speak and treat others. And I like seeing that because I think we can all relate to seeing evidence of that or maybe even having experienced it. And part of what makes the story so satisfying. I don't always approve of good or happy endings, but I feel like you do a nice little dance there and those last moments where everything happens really quickly. And then it is very satisfying. Yeah.
No, I was halfway through the story and I knew I was going to kill them. But part of it is the class stratification, too. It's very clear. They don't think of Gareth and Maddie as human.
Mhm.
They don't think of Samuel as human. They think of them as, that lower bunch of sheep that they're just supposed to take care of, and that's it.
Yeah, and talking about Jesus as a socialist, right? When you're reading the beginning of the story and the justifications for these laws, it's very, very clear to the reader, like, of course, this is going to vastly disproportionately harm poor people. And especially, if you're in a place where natural disasters are common, which I know you are in Oklahoma in real life. I've lived in the Midwest for years. Like, tornadoes are scary and they're disproportionately harmful to lower socioeconomic classes. And that is not very Jesus-like, right?
Well, and the situation we're in right now with healthcare
Yeah.
overall, which is a huge part of what inspired it to begin with, nobody can get at the medicine unless they're really wealthy.
Yeah.
Insurance is too expensive. Even the insurance companies, which like turning down claims and so on, still have a horrible time bringing down the prices to anything reasonable. So it's a grim situation all the way around.
This shows how paradoxically artificial the idea of something being natural is, right?
Yeah.
What's determined to be natural is like this convoluted human-made convention that, of course, the priests and the priesthood are abusing in this story. And so I think that contrast comes out really starkly. One detail that I really like in the story is the hats, because we have the priests and there's these obvious villains and they're very authoritative. And then, we know what happens at the end. They get sent up into the sky, Wizard of Oz style. And it's very satisfying. But the idea of them kind of fumbling with their hats is this bit of comedy that's also very humanizing in a way. It's like who's among us has not had some sort of hat situation at some point, and it feels kind of undignified. And it's sort of like you're just a person like everyone else. And I like that bit of humanizing them.
They're too egoistic not to wear the hats.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So there for a second, not having full regalia on.
So you talked about maybe identifying more with Maddie than Gareth. I've had a little bit of the opposite. I'm kind of squeamish. I think maybe some really bold actions I endorse in theory, but would have a really hard time carrying out in real life. And so I want to say that I appreciated having both of them there. They want the same things and they end up more or less doing the same things. Gareth doesn't have the access Maddie has, but he does all of the heretical stuff she does otherwise. I appreciated seeing that these people, even though they don't have the same temperament, can still kind of work together.
I have to say, I think I'm more like Gareth, but I want to be Maddie. Really bad. I think life would be infinitely simpler when we're Maddie because she's just brave and she's got, I think, enough faith in her own judgment. So far, it hasn't proved false, right? So that she doesn't sit around wittering about whether she was right or not.
Yeah.
It has to be empowering, right?
Eva, we've written about, using fiction to deliberate about real moral truths. And that was really nice what Kelly was just mentioning, where it's not just this moral dilemma that you're looking at and, do you or don't you, break the law, save lives, talk back, etc. But getting that first person perspective from Maddie, from Gareth, where even if you end up in the same kind of conclusion space, you have different ways of thinking about it. And, that there's all sorts of ways of approaching morality, and that it can be this very individual thing, even if there are maybe some general truths we can access. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Oh, that just fell out when I was writing the story. I wanted someone who was reflective and who second guessed himself a lot. And then I wanted someone who was the kind of person I wanted to be, and that was Maddie. And of course they agreed, right? Because they were right. One of the things that I've run across with publishers and with people who are reading it is they really want a lady or the tiger kind of approach. But that's not what thought experiments do. Thought experiments take a side. So I never really understood having to have it be incredibly vague and there's no right answer and what should you do. If a thought experiment works like an argument, and if that's how literature is supposed to work when it is like a thought experiment, then surely it takes a side. It bothers me a bit if it somehow becomes a mandatory literary thing, that it's only philosophically interesting if it doesn't take a side and it shows two completely convincing things.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the demands of fiction, from my perspective, is that it tell the truth. Like, that's what people are looking for in fiction. I forget who said this, but someone said, when people read my nonfiction, they're looking for what's false. And when they read my fiction, they're looking for what's true.
I like that.
I think that's present in what you were saying, Eva. And in this story, we really have these moral exemplars in a way that you can't get in a thought experiment. Maybe someone's brave or something, but until you get their thoughts, their perspectives, and kind of sit with them longer in their actions and their circumstances, it's hard to be affected in that same sort of way when you have something written out as more like an argument or a very barely described thought experiment like we often find in academic writing.
Well, I'm thinking your typical utilitarian deontologist counterexamples, right? They're stories. They're really short stories. And there are moreover stories where you can't subscribe to the theory that's being argued for, because that's begging the question. And you can't subscribe to the opposite theory. So it's supposed to elicit a pre-theoretical emotional reaction of approval or disapproval. That's what a thought experiment does. That's what stories sometimes do better. Fiction is for arousing emotion. Fiction is for getting people to take sides. Fiction does that incredibly well.
And I love that fiction also opens up this wider ground of possibility. Even as we're arguing for one particular side in fiction, we can still, like you've done, show this range of approaches. Whereas often in a thought experiment, like you said, it's just kind of one or the other. What do you pick? And that's not true to life. And then we get, students in our classes who say, well, could this alternate thing be a possibility? And oftentimes the answer is, yeah, but in the thought experiment, the people on the trolley tracks are just anonymous people, and that's what the experiment is. You can't kind of insert this humanity into it. And so I really appreciated the humanity in your story.
Well, and one of the fascinating things is, and, I would like to attack the deontological examples more, but both sides do it. What you said about the trolley example, the stipulations. So there you are, and there's a guy behind you, and a poisoned arrow is heading toward you, and you duck, and the arrow hits the guy behind you. And then the deontologist says, but of course, it's much more wrong if you yank the guy and shove him in front of the arrow, even though the result is the same. And what you want to say is, yeah, but there were alternatives in the second case, right? You could have jumped aside. You didn't have to yank the politician you hate was in front of the arrow, right?
Yeah, I like that.
Which is why, in fact, stories can be much more convincing.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. So this idea that we can use fiction, and maybe fiction is even better at getting us to grasp these interesting, maybe moral understandings.
I'm still percolating on thought experiments.
Well, they're not so trendy, right? They're not very trendy these days, you know?
So there are some things that I say to my students to kind of motivate why we talk about them in philosophy classes. And one of the ideas is that you're kind of isolating variables like we do in math, right? You try to get one thing by itself and get rid of this stuff that might affect our judgments in ordinary cases to kind of distill the moral principle or see what really matters. And we do this kind of thing in science too. It's not exactly isolating variables, but thinking about extreme cases. Like the theory of general relativity doesn't work right outside a black hole. And so general relativity is false. But like that's an extreme case if we've ever heard of one. Is there value in doing that with moral cases or with our intuitions about metaphysics or things like that? Take them to an extreme case where you can really see what matters. I don't know. I feel like there's something I want to push back on there, which is not to diminish at all the value of fiction, but to say that maybe there's also a place for these kinds of really bare stories that we tell to pull out people's intuitions.
No, I agree with you. I mean, you can do them with fiction or not. The problem is fiction's got tons of distractions and this doesn't. So you're right. It can be absolutely clean. I still think the kind of ethical experiment I was thinking about, it's intended to elicit an emotional response. The theory is tripped out, right? That's the whole point. Isolate the variables. And then what's left? Approval and disapproval, which according to human, at any rate, are emotions. So,
Well, and we know that emotion and reason are not antithetical to one another.
exactly.
As we near the end of our time together, is there anything you'd like to promote or recommend or anything we can celebrate with you?
I did write a novel, an academic farce at one time that is now completely outdated, but is still available on Kindle called The Sleep of Reason. But what I'd really like to recommend isn't anything of mine. Daniel Abraham wrote a series called The Long Price Quartet. It is magnificent, and it is so philosophically adept. It dances around essentialism. It's a fantasy series. It's beautifully written. He's the guy who co-wrote The Expanse. He's very good.
Yeah.
And it proposes that poets, when they write well enough, when they capture the absolute essence of something well enough, make it concrete, make it material, give it a mind, and then use it as a weapon against the neighboring nation. It's wonderful. He's a lovely writer. So I would recommend him.
That's super cool. Wasn't it Audre Lorde who said that poetry was what you need to fight back? Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you for the recommendation.
And our last question for today. Tell us, Eva, what's your perfect reading spot?
I have a lazy boy recliner that is only partially eaten by dogs. Only the back of it is eaten by dogs. So the bit that you sit in is fine. And I will sit in the recliner with my skipper key in my lap and read. That is my all-time favorite spot for reading.
That sounds indulgent. Thank you so much for joining us today.
I had a wonderful time. Thank you.
Wonderful. That's it for today. Thanks for listening, story lovers, and tune in next time for a brand new story.
This episode was produced by Chelsea Haramia and Kelly Weirich. It was edited by Kelly Weirich with original music by the inimitable Hain Mao. You can find us at Buzzsprout, Spotify, or anywhere you find podcasts. Like and subscribe to add a little intrinsic value to the world.
Have you written a story that you think is perfect for Storyfi? Send it to Chelsea and Kelly at storyfipodcast@gmail.com. Funding provided by the American Philosophical Association.